Scott Walker being honest, put him on a phone call where he thinks he's talking to a Koch brother. You're going to hear straight shooting exactly where he's coming from. And the fact of the matter is what they were talking about was using money to make sure that the Republican Party would become an extension of Scott Walker. Not where Republican state senators and state representatives would say, you know, all the nurses and teachers and snowplow drivers and social workers from my community are marching outside the Capitol. Maybe I ought to listen to them. And that's what good Republicans of the past would have done. They would have told Scott Walker, we are not going to attack our unions. We are not going to attack public education. We are not going to attack public services. They would have said, we won't do that because we're Wisconsinites and we're not going to follow the Koch brothers' agenda to change Wisconsin. That's what they would have said. But they didn't because the money was there. That's the fundamental truth to understand. And so Scott Walker remade the Republican Party in Wisconsin as an extension of himself. And he also weaponized governance as a tool to undermine democracy. And you say to me, well, Mr. Nichols, that sounds like a pretty bad thing. And it is. These people came to power, and the first thing they did was attack the rights of working people to organize unions and to challenge the power of corporations and government. The very first thing they did was attack what we as a country say democracies around the world have to have, which is free trade unions. And when they got done doing that, and they would have done this other thing quicker, but it took a little time, because doing a lot of really bad stuff can take time. They then attacked the rights of people to overturn what they have done by gerrymandering our state legislature in a way that our elections would no longer be fair or functional. They redrew those lines for the state assembly, and in the first election after they did it, 175,000 more Wisconsinites voted for a Democratic Party organized legislature, and yet we ended up with essentially the same Republican majority in the legislature. Brothers and sisters, that is not democracy. That is the rigging of the system by politicians who do not want to be held to account. They attacked our unions. They attacked our right to have a functional voting system, functional democracy itself in elections. And then they attacked our right to vote. They developed restrictive voter ID laws that the courts said threatened to disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of Wisconsinites. They pushed those laws through. They attacked early voting. They tried to attack Sunday voting so you couldn't do souls to the polls. They attacked it left and right to undermine our ability as citizens to rise up and challenge their power. And they weren't done there. Then they attacked the state Supreme Court of Wisconsin. They they rushed through and fought for an amendment to the Constitution of the state and structural changes to the Supreme Court so that the Chief Justice of our court, Shirley Abramson, one of the most distinguished jurists, not just in Wisconsin, but in the nation, one of the most distinguished jurists, not just in our time, but in our history, so that she could no longer be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, despite the fact that the structures of the court had always been that the senior jurist served as Chief Justice, despite the fact that a woman had finally risen on her skills and her merit to this position. They said, oh, no, we're going to change that now. We're going to change the courts of this state. We're going to pour hundreds and thousands and millions of dollars into campaigns to defeat distinguished jurists like Louis Butler. We're going to attack the courts again and again and again so that the courts will no longer stand on the side of the people of this state and justice. They deliberately corrupted the Supreme Court of Wisconsin to undermine the democracy of this state. And then you think, well, they've got to be done now. But no. And Donald Trump, you think Donald Trump doesn't take notes on these things? Then they said, well, there's been an inquiry into corruption in the politics of Wisconsin. The district attorney of Milwaukee County and other district attorneys and jurists around the state have been investigating corruption in our politics. And suddenly, their Supreme Court and their legislature shuts down the investigations to try and undermine the ability of the people to know what has been done to their democracy. And then, no, they're not done then. Then they gut the campaign finance laws of the state and overturn them so that they are no longer functional. Then they attack the Government Accountability Board. They tear it to shreds. They create two separate boards, a Board of Elections, a Board of Ethics, and then they undermine the functionality of the Elections Board and the Ethics Board by politicizing them in exactly the way that they were arranged not to be. At every single turn, they have sought to undermine democracy in this state. And it has had a profound impact. Do you really think that if the unions in Wisconsin were as strong as they were in 2008, when Barack Obama swept this state, that Donald Trump would have won this state in 2016? No, that would not have happened. When you undermine trade unions, you weaken an organizing bloc that counters corporate money. The weakening of the unions had a profound impact. Do you really think that if they hadn't done the voter ID law, if they hadn't done the assaults on early voting and all the other structural assaults they attempted to do and did as regards our democracy, do you really think that the state that voted for Barack Obama twice would have voted for Donald Trump in 2016? The answer is no, it would not have happened. Understand what occurred in our state. Structural changes were made that rendered our democracy less functional than it should be. And then they were exported to other states. Michigan changed to a right-to-work state. Michigan, the founding state of the United Auto Workers. Indiana changed. Pennsylvania, they tried to make changes to voter ID. In Ohio, they tried to attack the unions and do different forms of voter ID there. They tried to change the voting structures of that state. State after state after state, they said it. They said, look, they did it in Wisconsin. Wisconsin, the state of Robert M. La Follette. Wisconsin, the state of Russ Feingold. Wisconsin, the state of Tammy Baldwin and Gwen Moore, they made those changes there. Why don't we make them in Michigan? Why don't we make them in Pennsylvania? Why don't we make them in Ohio? Why don't we make them in Indiana? Well, brothers and sisters, in 2008, Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana all voted for Barack Obama for President of the United States. And in 2012, they all voted for Donald Trump. Do not fail to recognize that when they mangle our democracy, when they attack our unions, when they attack our voting rights, it isn't just a theoretical discussion. It is a discussion about undermining democracy in ways that create political results. Donald Trump is president of the United States because of the machinations of men like Scott Walker. And we need to understand that if you want to address the crisis of the Trump moment, you begin at the root of the problem. And if you want to begin at the root of the problem, you must vote on November 6th and vote for people that will take this state back from what it has been. struggle. It happens to begin here in this state, and rightly so. This is a great state, and this is a state that recognizes the necessity of resistance. Our roots are in the resistance against that which is wrong in this country. They go back far, far into our history. We have made errors along the way. There is no question of that. But we have righted our errors, and in doing so, we have then reached out to the rest of the country and said, we have to act. And our resistance has been writ large across the last 2 years. This is why I am hopeful in this moment, brothers and sisters. You know, Scott Walker got so used to being powerful, got so used to getting away with anything, that he actually thought he could cancel special elections. Right? He said, oh, yeah, we don't need to have elections, right? You know, it's in the state constitution. You're supposed to call a special election when a state legislature leaves office, but we don't have to do that. And so he finished the first year of Donald Trump's presidency by appointing a couple of legislators to kind of low-level state jobs, leaving a state Senate seat open, right? In fact, he had one Senate seat open in the western part of the state, then another one open in the eastern part of the state. He allowed a special election in the western part of the state, and you know what happened? A woman came along and won the seat over the Republican guy they had set up to take it, and Scott Walker was like, oh my, that doesn't look good. And so they had a special election scheduled over in the eastern part of the state, or should have been scheduled, and Scott Walker said, we don't have to have it this year. Because the legislature is going to do nothing. Now, how does a governor tell you that the legislature is going to do nothing this year? He doesn't tell you that if you have a legislature that is in charge of its own destiny and is setting its own direction. He doesn't do that if you have a system of checks and balances where you respect each branch of government equally. He does that if he thinks he has complete control over the legislature of Wisconsin because he has complete control over the Republican Party, and he knows that Robin Boss and Mr. Fitzgerald will do what he tells them to do. That is not a governor working with the functional realities of the state. That is a governor pushing aside democracy and balanced governance and putting his own will, not merely on the legislature, but on democracy itself. We're not going to hold those special elections. Now, a very interesting thing happened in Wisconsin. The people of Wisconsin said, you know what? I'm sorry, Scott Walker. We think we have a right to vote for the people who represent us in the legislature, and we don't think we should go a year without elected representation. And lawsuits were filed, and Scott Walker lost. Scott Walker's reaction was, oh, I'll find another judge. They went to another judge. The next judge said, no, you're violating the law here, sir. You're not respecting the Constitution. So he said, well, I'll find another one. Eventually, he ran out of judges. And Scott Walker had to call that special election in eastern Wisconsin, and a district that hasn't elected a Democrat since Jimmy Carter was president sent Caleb Frostman to the state Senate, a Democrat elected in a district that had been historic. You understand why I'm hopeful, brothers and sisters? This governor, he's trying to hold the door shut. He's trying to keep the resistance from coming in, but the resistance said, you know what? We don't like very much what you've been doing to the Supreme Court either. And so in the spring of this year, a young woman from Milwaukee County, Rebecca Dallett, ran for the Supreme Court of Wisconsin, and that woman who appeared at women's rallies and said this is about more than parties and ideology. This is about the human experience, and we got to have a court that reflects who we are. That woman didn't just win, she swept into the Supreme Court in a landslide election. Our governor, he wasn't done. He's like, oh, I know I got almost everything under control here. I just got to get rid of the state treasurer. The state treasurer, with all due respect, is not the most powerful office in Wisconsin. But the state treasurer had a little bit of power. State treasurer sits on the Board of Lands, right? Oversees all the land that the state owns. It needs to make decisions about environmental issues, perhaps. And here's an interesting thing. Scott Walker and his people, they said, well, the people that looking at these environmental issues, they can't talk about climate change. Right? So state treasurer is kind of a somewhat consequential office. And then it turns out, well, they also oversee a lot of education funding and things like that. It might even be that if this board started to take some of these issues seriously, maybe they could address the student loan crisis. Maybe they could address the expense of higher education. And oh my gosh, Scott Walker decided it is time to get rid of the state treasurer's office because he doesn't want somebody on that board that might say no to what he wants to do. And so they put it on the constitutional referendum. They put it on the state ballot this spring. And they said, it's got to go. Scott Walker made a big deal of this. The state treasurer's office, it's inefficient. It's old. It was created at the founding of the state. Who wants things that were created at the founding of the state? Let's not remember our history. People voting on too many things. It's very complicated. They don't need to worry their little heads. Well, you know what the people of Wisconsin decided to do? They decided to worry their little heads. And the fact is, they decided to listen to a young woman named Sarah Godlewski who said that we should save the office of state treasurer. And in April of this year, when they went to vote, and Scott Walker tweeted on that April election day about how important it was to get rid of the office of state treasurer, the people of Wisconsin decided by a 2-1 margin that they want to keep electing their officials because Wisconsin decided it prefers democracy to governors ruling everything. Oh, brothers and sisters, this year has been a glorious year. I know it's disappointing in Washington. I know when bad people are in charge, bad things happen. I recognize that. But can you not feel the rising tide of democracy? Can you not feel that spirit coming alive in our state? Not just in Milwaukee and Madison, but in small towns across Wisconsin where teachers are deciding to run for the state legislature against the people who cut education and public services. Can you not feel that rising tide? Brothers and sisters, we gather tonight, 60 years on, after a president or after a governor came in and started his tenure by taking on collective bargaining rights for public employees. And we look at a ticket of people running against those folks. An educator, a young guy, 31 years old from Milwaukee, involved in civil rights and community organizing. A young woman who fought to keep the state treasurer's office, an attorney general candidate, the son of Peg Lodgeslaughter, the greatest attorney general in this state's history. And you look at this ticket, and then a guy named LaFollette. And up there on top, you got Tammy Baldwin running for the U.S. Senate. And you say, and I hear people say, oh, the Democrats, they can't possibly win. Well, brothers and sisters, I know a little bit about history. And history tells me when you have a pattern of resistance, when you have a pattern of victory, when people start to recognize what's been done to them and they rise up to change it, when they get to that November, they elect the people that will give them their state back. Wisconsin's year has come. We changed the state and we changed the nation.